When I first got hired by the airlines, I honestly made a huge mistake that almost made me want to quit being an airline pilot. In this video, I'm going to teach you all the things I did wrong and give you the best tips so you can have the best quality of life starting out immediately once you get hired by an airline. My name is John. I currently work for a major airline flying the Airbus A320 series airplane, and I've worked for a regional prior to this for about 2.5 years. Before that, I was an end of course check ride examiner for a Part 141 school, and I've also commuted for 2.5 of my 4 years of airline experience. I've done the good commute, the bad commute, and I've also lived in base, so I have a really well-rounded perspective on this topic. Later on, I'm going to tell you my biggest tip on earning extra money as an airline pilot or a flight attendant, and to be honest, it's worth tens of thousands of dollars, so it's definitely worth listening to the end. With all that being said, welcome to the airlines. We're really happy to have you, and let's get into the video. So this first tip is going to be for mostly airline pilots, and specifically regional airline pilots, but also major airlines. Once you get hired by an airline, usually that airline is going to tell you, hey, you can choose from either the ERJ or the CRJ. Depending on the choice, one is usually going to be a lot quicker to get into than the other. Sometimes they are pretty similar though, and that's important, and I'll tell you in a minute. The number one question I want to ask you is, do you live in one of the pilot domiciles for one of those airplanes? If the answer is yes, then choose that airplane. It's very simple. If the answer is no, we have to look at what's the best commute possible for which airplane type. From personal experience, I made a massive mistake here because I actually chose an airplane that I did not live in base at, and it caused me to commute for over 1.5 years. The reason why I made that choice, I kind of fell into something called shiny jet syndrome. What shiny jet syndrome really is, I wanted to fly the E-Jet or the ERJ 175 versus the CRJ. The reason why I wanted to fly the ERJ was because the flying was just better. You have way bigger cities, more diverse kind of flying, up and down the West Coast a lot more, and the actual flights were much longer, and I wouldn't even consider regional flying for some of the stuff I was doing, where it was 3-hour flights. Versus on the CRJ side, those guys were doing up to 5 legs a day. They weren't leaving the state of Texas, and it was a lot more work. The problem I did not consider though was I was going to be a lifelong commuter under the ERJ. This brings us to the part of the story where I flew from Phoenix to Minneapolis for a commute for my regional airline. It was a 2.5-hour commute to go start my trip. This could have been avoided if I would have just chosen the CRJ, but I really didn't want to fly the CRJ, and I was naive at the time. So the number one thing I recommend for regional pilots is suck it up and choose the airplane that you actually live in base in. Now this next point relates to both major airlines and regional pilots for choosing the airplane. For the major airlines, they usually don't choose the airplane until they go through indoctrination, or INDOC for short. During INDOC, you'll get assigned a seniority number, and basically the seniority in class is determined either by the social security number being the highest or lowest, is the most senior, or by the age. Those are usually the typical ways that seniority is established within your class. At major airlines, they'll have different vacancies for different bases on different airplanes, and at the regional, you'll know the airplane you're going to be flying before you actually go to INDOC. But the main point of this is just because the airplane is not the shiny jet doesn't mean it's the wrong one to choose. I'll give you an example. Let's say you work for a legacy carrier and you live in Orlando. The only base that is currently in Orlando is for one type of airplane, the 737. But let's say for whatever reason you really hate the 737, and you're going to say to yourself, I'm going to bid for the Airbus A320 over the 737. This is obviously a mistake because you immediately put yourself into being a commuter unless the company somewhat changes to an Airbus fleet being staffed there. This is the mistake I fell into, and I highly recommend not doing that. Choose the fleet that actually has a base where you live, because if not, you're going to set yourself up for failure almost immediately. My biggest mistake was also assuming that my company was going to magically overnight to turn Phoenix into an ERJ base. It ended up happening, but it took 1.5 years for that to happen, and it was not a guaranteed thing. And honestly, looking back, it was a pretty naive way to think that, oh, my airline's definitely going to be doing this one decision. I should bank on that occurring. I think the last point I want to make on choosing an airplane is somewhat controversial, but hear me out on why I think this way. Let's say the CRJ base was still in Phoenix, and I was offered an ERJ class date a month prior to a CRJ class date. I think looking back on it, I actually would have told the recruiter I would wait for the CRJ base 1 to 3 months of a wait. And the reason why I say that is because if I could avoid commuting for 1.5 years with my family at home and being away from them for such a long time, and have the assurance of knowing that I could get back into base depending on whatever vacancy report is published at some point, I think I would have done that versus just taking the first class date available, not knowing if I ever could get back into base unless I upgrade into a different airplane type. Again, a lot of people are going to tell you that's the wrong way to think, because if you have seniority, you could avoid a furlough, you could avoid whatever. And I understand that. So there is some pros and cons, but to be honest, I've lived both ways. And I think I would have gave up the seniority if I could have lived in base and avoided the long-term commute. All right, let's fast forward to you choosing an airline base. This isn't necessarily a choice. It's going to be what the company is offering in that latest vacancy report when you get hired. I want to help you decide how to rank which base you want to be based at, or once you get your initial award, what you should try to be aiming towards to make your life the easiest it can be as a commuter. The first piece of advice I want to give you is looking at how many daily flights occur between the city that you live in and the base that you want to go and fly at. Now, it might be simple. Oh, I know they have a lot of flights between Phoenix and Oakland or Phoenix and Denver, but you have to look at the specifics, and you also have to look at what time of day are those flights at. If we pull up an example between, let's say, a commute from Phoenix to Minneapolis, which is what I did, versus Phoenix and Boise, which is actually a regional carrier's base, then you're going to see a lot of different variation, and you'll see what I'm talking about. Let's look at the example from Phoenix to Minneapolis. There's over 10 flights a day, one starting at 7 a.m. and the last flight leaving around 6 p.m. You have 10 different opportunities to make it to work. It's a 2.5-hour commute, so you have to weigh that in, but also there's a ton of different variations of how to get to work. Let's look at the Boise example. You have 5 different options to get to work, and the time frames are not ideal for being a commuter. Within looking at these flights, you also want to look at what times they depart at. You're looking for really early morning departures and consistency throughout the day and no big gaps in between. And then also the last flight of the day, how late does that leave? It could be the make or break moment between you making the flight and running to the gate, or it could be you spending an extra 4 days in base because you couldn't make it back in time to catch the last flight of the day. I know 2 to 4 days might not sound like a lot for sacrificing for having to stay until the next morning for catching a flight, but honestly, every single day in the airlines matters because you only have so many days off in a row or so many days off in a total month. Another major point that is going to affect your quality of life in the commute is how many commuters are on that route. Take, for example, Phoenix to Los Angeles. It's probably one of the worst commutes you could do because there's an insane amount of commuters going back and forth between them, especially as a regional airline pilot because there's only a couple different regional flights between Phoenix and Los Angeles per day. And the issue you're going to find yourself in is you're always going to be lower on the priority list for getting a jump seat or a non-ref seat in the back. There's been so many times I've listed for the flight deck jump seat only to be beaten out by a mainline pilot running to the gate last second, and he technically has better seniority within the company, obviously, because he flies for them than I do. So he gets the jump seat and I have to go and spend the night at the airport. When you're looking at what base you should bid for, how many times does your airline operate that route? The more it operates it, the better it's going to be. The next main point I want to talk about is, should I choose a base that I can be more senior in right away, or should I go to a better base that I have less seniority in? I'm going to give you my perspective on living this out because I think there's some real value that you can learn from this. Back when I got hired by the airline I fly for currently, I got based in Chicago right away. I chose that base because my buddy lives there and I could crash with him instead of being at a crash pad. So the pros were for me is I could cut down the commuting costs and I could stay with a buddy of mine. The cons were it was a 2.5-hour flight. I had to cover both Chicago O'Hare and Chicago Midway, which was not easy to do. The opportunity later became available to be able to bid into Las Vegas. Las Vegas was only a 40-minute flight, and it was much easier to get to with multiple flights operating by my airline alone and about 12 different flights every single day. Another big perk was my wife's family actually lived in Vegas, so I could actually go out and crash with them and live in a house instead of a crash pad as well. The last big perk was I could drive my car from Phoenix to Vegas, and I could use my car to basically do whatever I wanted during my day unless I got called in for work. I cannot understate enough, you being able to have your own transportation when you're on reserve somewhere that you don't live, you actually have freedom and you have a life again. So if at all possible, this is what I recommend. Now, technically, yeah, my seniority was less in Vegas. I was bidding about like 97%. I was almost the plug. All those different pros I got for living in Vegas and commuting to Vegas was so much easier than being 79% senior and possibly holding a line in Chicago with the 2.5-hour, 3-hour flight, the less loads that were occurring from Phoenix to Chicago, and also the jet lag as well. The next tip I have for you is look at the time zone changes. A lot of people underestimate time zones. When I lived in Phoenix and I was commuting to Minneapolis, one of the hardest things for me was commuting in the night before to be on a reserve or in the morning reserve starting at 4 or 5 a.m. If I were to hypothetically get called at 4 a.m., my body clock time could be 1 a.m. Now, this is really difficult because it might not seem like that big of a deal doing it once in a while, but let's say my body clock time, I got called in at 1 a.m. body clock time, reported for a 3 or 4 day trip that had all the rest of the day's East Coast morning reports. That's another hour ahead of what I was on Phoenix time. So the reality is that for a 5 a.m. departure on the East Coast, my wake up call could be around 1 a.m. And the real problem you're going to find yourself running into is it's not that big of a deal for 1 or 2 weeks in a row like that. If you consistently do that over months of time, it's going to wreck your circadian rhythm and you're going to get into something called chronic fatigue. By doing these different tips of being able to have my car, being able to have a free place to stay, and being able to be on the same time zone, it dramatically increased my quality of life and actually made the job a lot more enjoyable. Back when I was commuting to Minneapolis and I was only getting really 8 to 10 days off at home in Phoenix, I seriously told my wife at the time, I said, I don't know if I can do this long term. The last main point I want to bring up is, what does your life look like as a commuter once you get into your domicile and not necessarily have gotten a trip yet? A lot of people underestimate how expensive commuting can actually be with the crash bed costs, with DoorDash costs, with Uber costs, transportation in general. It can add up very quickly. On year one pay, you're going to be pinching pennies to try to make everything work, especially if you're supporting a family at home. So some questions I want you to think about for the commuter lifestyle is, how much money are you going to set aside for a crash pad per month? Are you okay with being in 5 or 6 different people in bunk beds in a room, getting up at all times of the night, and never being able to get consistent sleep because everyone's crew scheduling is calling them at 4 a.m. and you just got back from a trip at 2 a.m.? Or do you need to get a private room? Well, the private room is obviously going to cost more. How much money do you have starting out to be able to afford that? A lot of people don't think about that, and it's going to drive them crazy being in a bunk bed, so they might have to sacrifice more money for more privacy in that sense. Another thing to think about is, how are you going to get around town and how are you going to get to and from the airport? Is there public transportation? How much does an Uber cost from the crash pad to the airport? How about at peak times? Are they available at all times throughout the day? Again, these questions you don't totally consider until you're living it out and all of a sudden you get an Uber cost for $100 and you weren't expecting that, but you have no other way of getting home. This is my biggest concern when I was commuting in Chicago. Getting from Chicago Midway to downtown Chicago on the L train at 2 a.m. was not safe when I had my pilot uniform on. So I took an Uber and it cost $100. The next thing I want to bring up is how to be healthy on the road. When I first got started in the airlines, I was in pretty good shape. I ended up gaining over 50 pounds my first year flying for the airlines. That's because I was getting tired often because my circadian rhythm was always messed up. I never made health a priority. If you're not careful, your health will seriously degrade over time being a commuter. So you have to make an active effort to at least get 10,000 steps per day. And what I would recommend doing is counting your calories. That way you can keep yourself in check. The last point I want to make for the commuter lifestyle is, what does the weather look like in the base that you're going to be operating out of? If you're in JFK in the wintertime, there's going to be a lot of issues getting to and from work just because you're going to have to come in a couple days early if there's a snowstorm expected. The same thing for getting out of work. Once flights start canceling, it becomes significantly more challenging to get to work because there's no space available and you're competing against a lot more people for the jump seat as well. The last main point I want to make for the commuting lifestyle is, you're going to have an immense amount of time doing nothing once you get into your domicile and you haven't got called for reserve. A lot of people make the mistake of just doom scrolling, sitting in their bunk, or not going out and getting fresh air. I'm going to tell you this is a mistake because you're wasting your life away doing nothing and being chronically addicted to your phone. If I could go back and change one thing I did differently on reserve, I would go out and I'd set a couple different goals for myself. Right now, I'm currently running a half marathon on Thanksgiving Day. I would have set a goal for myself to be in as best shape as possible because I have nothing but time and I can go to the gym, I can go on walks. I really had as much free time as I wanted, so there's no excuse for me not to be healthy. Another goal you can make for yourself is, if you're entrepreneurial, you could go out and create a business, or you could start doing a hobby of yours like YouTube videos like we're doing right now. I'm on a layover right now and I have plenty of time to be able to make videos, so I'm trying to use my time efficiently instead of just doom scrolling on my phone. Now, the last thing I want to bring up in today's video is probably my biggest piece of advice for anyone getting into the airlines. And it seems obvious, but it honestly has changed my life and it's made me so excited for the future of the airlines. My biggest tip for you is to live in base. There is nothing that will trump living in base. You will never have to worry about checking a flight load of going to or from work. You won't have to live in a crash pad anywhere. You inherently can live a much healthier life living in your own home and having your own set workout routine. You never have to worry about time zone shifts for constantly commuting to a different time zone. And lastly, the amount of money you can make from living in base is quite literally tens of thousands of dollars more. And the reason how people do this is picking up premium trips. Now, premium trips can happen for all different sorts of reasons. A lot of times people call out last second. So what happens is the company needs to have that flying covered. And what they do is they release the trip paying at double time, triple time, and higher than that if it's really crazy. A lot of times the premium trip could be one flight and a deadhead home, and you could get paid triple the amount for operating one leg. Honestly, it's pretty crazy, and people can make bank doing it. But as a commuter, you don't really have access to that because usually they drop 2 or 3 hours before they're required for you to be at the airport. So you really only have access to those things by living in base. Living in base was so important for me and my family that we actually decided to move across the country to be able to live in base where we do right now in Atlanta. I was bidding 89% in Phoenix, and now I'm bidding 47%. And I also only drive 30 minutes to work. It's honestly a game changer. I spend way more time with my family than I did before in Phoenix. And it's also led me to lose another 65 pounds in the last year. I'm a much healthier person. I'm a much happier person not being a commuter. Although I do have empathy for those people doing commutes, as I know it's not always possible, I would say have a serious discussion with your spouse saying, can we make it work by moving into base? Because not only is your life going to be happier, but your wife and your children's lives will most likely be happier too if you're home more often and you have a more consistent schedule. If you like this video, you should definitely check out our weekly podcast my co-host Scott and I do, covering all things aviation. We bring in a lot of great guests and we cover all things airlines and corporate aviation. We have so many different amazing conversations with such interesting people from around the industry. I definitely recommend you listen to it, and I think you're going to find a lot of value if you like this video. And let me be the first person to welcome you to the Airlines. We're super excited to have you, and hopefully you learned a thing or two. We'll see you next week.